One of them, R.I.P., but she died last year, and she's the one who I like. Ginger Rogers. No more Ginger, but the other ones are all here. Yes. So the cat next to me was thanked in my book.
That's important.
I know it's lame, but
it's not lame. It's beautiful.
Of course, I'm going to thank my cats.
Yeah. I see people are still kind of trickling in, so we'll give it one more minute or so, and then we will get started.
Sounds good.
Many people I know. Hi, people. Hi, Lucy. Hi, Robin.
See, aren't you glad about the visuals?
It is nice. It is nice.
Yeah. Did you do this for any of your events too, Lynn? Did you have video?
Nora said so.
Yeah, we had it at the McNally one I did with. We had it like this, and it was nice.
It was nice.
Yeah. And I did a panel on rejection where it was also like this, and that felt apt. That we
all see each other.
It's rough out there, man.
Judgment.
Yeah.
All right, shall we get started?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maris Kreisman, and I run events and marketing for McNally Jackson. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you to another excellent virtual event for the store. If you go to McNallyJackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. I'm adding more every day, so please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming soon. We're glad that though we can't all be in the same room at the same time, we're still able to host events like this during this difficult time. This event is free, but we do have copies of Allison's book, Being Lolita, for sale on our website. I'll post the link to buy it from us in the Zoom chat in just a few moments. As we've changed phases from staying at home to opening for curbside pickup to admitting customers into some of our locations, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy events like this and want us to keep hosting more of them, please order books from us. We'd greatly appreciate it. Now I stop begging. We will take questions tonight from the audience. You can just put them in the chat at any time, so don't be shy. And now I'm going to introduce three amazing women to you. Michele Filgate. Her work has appeared in Long Reads, The Washington Post, The LA Times, The Boston Globe, The Paris Review Daily, Tin House, Gulf Coast, O, BuzzFeed, Refinery 29, and many other publications. Currently, she's an MFA student at NYU, where she is the recipient of the Stein Fellowship. She's a contributing editor at Literary Hub and teaches at the Sackett Street Writers Workshop and Catapult. What my mother and I don't talk about is her first book. Hi, Michele.
Hello.
Lynn Steger Strong's first novel, Hold Still, was released by Liverite W.W. Norton in 2016. Her nonfiction has been published by Guernica, the LA Review of Books, Elle.com, Catapult, LitHub, and others. She teaches both fiction and nonfiction writing at Columbia University, Fairfield University, and the Pratt Institute. Her second novel, Wand, yes, see,
I think it's an old bio. Yeah,
that's an old bio. I was reading it and thinking, so sorry about that, Lynn. You should buy her second novel that Allison is holding up right now. I'll put a link. And our star of the evening, Allison Wood, is an award-winning writer whose essays have been published in the New York Times, Catapult, and Epiphany. She holds an MFA in fiction from NYU. She teaches creative writing at her alma mater and at Sackett Street Writers Workshop. She's the founder and editor-in-chief of Pigeon Pages, a New York City literary journal and reading series that you can see right here at McNally Jackson every month. Allison was a winner of the inaugural Breakout 8 Award from the Authors Guild and Epiphany. Being Lolita is her first book. Welcome, all of you. So thrilled to have you here.
Yay!
Yay!
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
so we're going to start out with the readings first, you guys, right?
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
So,
I guess I was asked in advance to go first, so I'm not just jumping. But I did want to just say thank you guys so much for having me. And I had the extraordinary privilege of reading Allison's work years ago. And it was a real thrill to get to read it in its final form. And I'm really honored to be a part of this and to celebrate this beautiful book. And it's also a hard book. And you know, I'm honored to know Allison and honored to have in a very small way seen this book into the world. So I'm going to read a very short part of my book, and then we'll go on. Since for obvious reasons, I'm going to read a teenage section, but it's very short. This is just it's the very beginning of the book. I'm 16 and Sasha's 17, and we go out to the beach at night and no one's there. We've thrown a party at her house and I have fallen, scraped my knee, getting a piggyback ride from a boy I know only offered it to me to impress her. You tired, runner girl, he said. They all call me runner girl. We've freed ourselves of all the other people. We've gotten drunk and already sobered up, and after emptying the keg, after cleaning up her parents' house, after putting people in their cars, we've brought the trash out to this dumpster by the beach and run out to put our bare feet in the sand. The water's quiet. Moon reflected off the top and sharp and tinny as the waves roll up, dark blues and blacks as they dip down. We each carried a large bag filled with empty cans and bottles, plastic cups, leftovers from the store-bought box cake we cooked too long, and the big bowl of pasta that we mixed with garlic, oil, cheese, and diced tomatoes. We both smell of sweat and beer. We've thrown a sort of week-late birthday party for her, while her mom and sister are traveling with her dad for work. No one except us knew it was a birthday party, and before the older kids arrived from the larger public school 10 miles from ours, we set out plates and napkins, knives and forks, and pretended we were grown. We poured glasses of wine, and we dressed up, and people looked confused when they came in, and we told them to sit down, when later we brought the cake out, and no one really knew what it was for. We each did cake stands, and our shirts rolled down our fronts, showing our bellies and our bras. I grabbed at my shirt, pushed back as it rolled down. She let hers sit around her neck. For a while, she went into her sister's room with some guy I run track with, about whom other girls at practice talk, to whom I've never said a word. That wasn't fun, I say to Sasha now, which is maybe wrong, but also she's the only person in the world to whom I say these things out loud. They're all so dumb, she says. She takes off her shirt and pants, and I try not to stare. Happy birthday, I say, thinking why did we invite those people we don't like when we could have spent the whole night just like this? She laughs and nods down at my clothes. You going in, she says. It's January, but it's Florida, so it's warm, and I take off my shirt and pants. We're both strong and swim out far, and though the water shocks at first, it feels better, safer. I feel surer than I ever feel on land. Back at her house an hour later, we take hot showers and then wrap our hair up in towels, and we sit on her big floral duvet, and she talks, and I half listen to the words she says, but also I lie back and let her talk pour out over top of me until my eyes are closed. I don't sleep well most nights. I wander the high-ceilinged, too-still, too-big upstairs of my parents' house, talk online to older men, pretending that I'm someone else. But I sleep hours, 10 or 12, halfway through the next day, these nights that I'm with her. That's it.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm Allison, and before I start, I just want to say how excited I am to be here with Lynn and Michele, both of whom I had the honor of being in their classes what seems like a million years ago, but wasn't, but somehow it feels like it was. And I'm just so grateful to have you both in my life now as like writer friends. And, you know, we're just all so lucky. And I'm just so grateful for all the wonderful women in my life like you two. So I'm just going to read the very opening of the book, which is Being Lolita. Being Lolita. The first time he kissed me, it wasn't on the mouth. I hadn't read the book yet. He told me it was a beautiful story about love. We would meet in the next town over, a diner off the highway, open all night. I would know what time to meet him in our booth in the back corner because, in the middle of his class, in front of everyone, he would look at me, look into my eyes, and write a number on the blackboard, 8 or 9 or 10, and then wipe it away with his other hand. He was an English teacher in my high school. His shirt sleeves were always chalk kissed with white. He was 26. The first time he saw me, I was 17. I would tell my parents I was going to a friend's house or studying somewhere, but really, I would be sitting across from him for hours. The pastel painting depicting Greek ruins on the walls above him, while he would grade his students' essays, and I would sometimes do my Latin conjugations. Mostly, I would write to him, in front of him, and he would bring it home or sometimes read it there under the 24-hour fluorescent and then write back. All over napkins, the paper placemats, scraps from school. We probably covered hundreds of pieces with cursive, but I have only the handful that I hid from him, kept close and stolen away. Before we would leave, he'd take the papers and napkins and rip them up, put them into our water glasses, and I would watch them lose their shape and the ink bleed. I wasn't allowed to keep things. I wasn't supposed to call him Mr. when we were alone, only his first name. But I could never call him that in school. No phone calls, no emails, no touching. He made the rules. The rules were broken at that diner in our booth. It was May. Summer was almost there and graduation hung in every classroom. Crepe paper and glue glitter banners filling the halls. A countdown everywhere. You couldn't escape it. He was trying to teach me about great literature, to prepare me for what I would face as a freshman in college just a few months in the future. You should definitely be an English major, he told me, leaning back into the booth, his arms stretched out on top of the bench, taking up so much space across from me. It was the pose that if we were on a date, unseen in a dark theater, would be the transition movement before he put his arm around me. He wouldn't bother with a fake cough, he'd just go for it, I was sure. He would read me the greats at our table of beige formica and dull silver. Poe, Dickens, Hawthorne, Carroll. He'd get into it, doing voices when he read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, laughing at literary jokes that I was surely supposed to understand, so I laughed too. I lapped it up, knowing how lucky I was to have this kind of private instruction. That night, he was reading Lolita to me, from the beginning of things. He spoke to me in Nabokov's opening lines languidly. Light of my life, fire of my loins. I thought it was the most romantic thing ever, but I was ruining it. I had a bug bite and I kept pushing my ankles together, trying to quell the tinge of itch. A child who couldn't sit still. He began rubbing the edges of the pages with his thumb, harder and harder as his voice grew louder, creating tiny rips in the paper as he stroked them. Finally, he asked, "A mosquito bite?" "Yes," I said, an invisible ruler against my spine. "Don't you have any calamine lotion?" "Not on me," I said. "You know," he said, "saliva can stop the itch." He looked at me. He had green eyes. My flip-flopped feet were on the cracked red leather next to him on the booth, my legs under the table bridging the gap between our benches. Not touching, just beside him. I followed the rules. He leaned down to my foot next to him and put his lips on my pink, swollen ankle. I felt his breath on my skin. And it was like every locker in the halls of my high school swung open at once, metal kissing cinder block walls. It felt just like that.
Thank you both for reading from your incredible books. It's such an honor to be here with both of you. And I want to jump right into the discussion because I have so many questions to ask you guys. And I'm going to start out by asking Allison a question I asked you when I interviewed you for Bomb magazine recently, which everyone should check out.
Michelle
because it's a
sucked it
great
in her-
interview. And there's also an incredible photo of Allison in this, published with this interview too. So you definitely have to check it out. So in the beginning of being Lolita, as we just heard, you read from it, an English teacher in your high school reads Lolita to you while you secretly meet in a diner.
Yeah.
And we learned that you were 17 at the time, and that Nick North, the teacher, was 27. And he used this classic and controversial novel to win your affection and take advantage of being in a position of power. And now you are a teacher yourself. You talk about this later on in the book. I'm wondering how you viewed Lolita when he introduced you to it, and what you think of it now. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, when I was 17, I didn't know what an unreliable narrator was, to start, which is sort of the crux of Lolita, that it is told from the point of view of Humbert, who is, a pedophile. And when you talk about the actual plot of Lolita, it is about the grooming, kidnapping, and repeated rape of this young girl, Dolores Hayes. But from Humbert's point of view, it's this great epic love story. And she is Lolita, and she's this, wanton sex pot, like seducing him the entire time. So when that was the reading of the book that was presented to me by someone who I thought was just like the bee's knees, I thought he was so cool. All the girls in my high school thought that he was like, the cute, smart, young teacher. And when that was what he told me the book was, I didn't know any better. And to be fair as well, like some readers even now will argue that that is sort of what the book is, that the book is a love story. It's a love story about language. It's a love story in a lot of different ways. That initial blurb from Vanity Fair, which is on the cover so often now, still says the greatest love story, the most convincing love story of our century. Mm-hmm. I mean, so while, looking back now, I think that's such a horrible way to explain it, and I believe it's a deep misreading. It's not like he was wildly outside the norm to interpret Lolita that way. However, the way that he used Lolita with me, the novel, as part of, using these sort of allusions and these big romantic gestures as a way to, what's the word I want to use, as a way to sort of underscore our relationship, that, this older man, younger girl, that's, okay, it's romantic, it's this big love. That is obviously not something I would agree with right now. And I really teach Lolita, when I teach Lolita, I don't teach the whole book. I would never teach the whole book. I think it's way too long. I think it needs to be edited down quite a bit. Nabokov, people who are really into it come at me, it's fine. I will argue that. But, I teach Lolita in context. And while there's still parts of Lolita that I love, the opening, Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, it's a beautiful opening. There's no way to argue that. But it's also incredibly manipulative in how, and effective in how it sets up so many things for the reader. It even tells you from the get-go that he's a murderer. You just always miss it because it's so beautiful and you're swept up with all of this. And I really think in a lot of ways that's a lot like what happened to me. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Lynn, I know that you're a teacher as well, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on Lolita and if you've taught it in the classroom at all.
We were cheating before, and we were talking about this because I have never taught Lolita in the classroom, but one of the reasons I think I've never taught it, and in some ways I think it's connected to Allison's book in interesting ways. And I was telling her before class, I was rereading the book today and reconsidering a choice that I just made, which is to say I have a class this semester for which Lolita or maybe Pale Fire, a Nabokov book, might work. It's on not unreliable, but on a made-up term, unhinged narrators. And I ultimately think I'm not going to teach it, but the reason I'm not going to teach it is, and this is, I think, again, back to one of the many interesting things about Allison's book, it's about authority and who gets it, right? Which is to say, like, I made a sort of call on Twitter and I said, hey, I'm teaching this class. My syllabus is basically done. Curious what people would do. And I got tons of responses. but about every third was Nabokov. And at first I was like, okay, yeah, that's on the list. But then I got so many Nabokovs that I was like, oh, this is just not interesting. You know, to Allison's point, again, he's a beautiful writer. There are thousands of beautiful writers, right? Nobody finishes graduate school having never read any Nabokov, right? But there are so many writers I could put on my syllabus that people wouldn't read otherwise, that I think I just prefer to put on my syllabus. And and again, back to authority and back to the way that different people take up different spaces. It's interesting, just as a teacher and thinking about time, all of Nabokov's books are, I would argue, too long.
Yeah.
And so to want to teach that, both in terms of like, he could have been edited more, but also in terms of they're hard to teach well in a single class, which is it's a long-winded way of saying I haven't, and I recently decided not to again. Although again, I think he's a great writer. It's just people are reading him, people are teaching him.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Lynn, about something you said in a profile Lauren LeBlanc wrote about you for The Observer. And she brought up how your main character in Want Elizabeth loses interest in sex and drinks even when she doesn't enjoy it. And you said in this interview, the only space that she has left to enact in agency is inside of her body. The only refusal that she can exercise is to not take in certain things. And I know that Virginia Woolf has influenced your writing so much. And one of the things that Woolf once wrote in her diary was, the army is the body, I am the brain, thinking is my fighting. So this is a question for both of you, actually, that in being Lolita and in Want, both of you fight against expectations of women's bodies. I'm wondering if each of you can talk about this idea and how it's relevant to each of your books.
Lynn, do you want to start?
I'm whatever you want.
You go first.
Okay. Well, again, I think I'm going to start with Allison's book, because I think she does a really beautiful job of showing the ways that this thing, especially young women, think is power, is then used against you, right? Which is to say, there's a great moment in Allison's book where she, in this amazing way that even made me uncomfortable, I think, to the book's credit, right, where the narrator is like, I was pretty, and she's like, that's a weird thing to say, but I was pretty, right? Because this idea that a woman would assert power is upsetting to begin with, right? So there's power in the female body, and that's interesting. But then we already know that. I think the interesting thing that Allison's book does is it reminds us that power is the power of the object. It's not the power of the subject, right? Like, so she's powerful because people look, right? But the idea that looking gives you power, gives you agency. Maybe agency is the word I'm looking for, right? Like, as to be a powerful object is not necessarily to be something with a lot of agency, right? And so then if we sort of turn that on the quote that you brought up with Lauren, I think the thing that I was talking about and was the idea that, so, you go on a journey like Allison's narrator went on, you sort of realize what felt like power is often and regularly held against you. How do you enact agency? I think often for a lot of women, we enact it on ourselves because it's the only space that we feel like we have power. So, whether that be through food, whether that be through, cutting, whatever that is, right? It's like, this is the only space where we feel in control. This is the only space where we have power, because the minute our body enters the world, it's not a subject, it's an object. Yeah.
I completely agree. And I think so much of what you just said is utterly accurate, not just like for me as a 17-year-old when I was sort of the time that I was writing about, but I think whether we like it or not, that's still how women's bodies are interpreted and engaged with in the world. And I think sort of to both oversimplify and to be clear, I think it is a lot about the patriarchy. And I think it is very much a feminist issue. I think one of the things you were talking about with looking, something that always strikes me in Lolita, and I read it too many times. But so much of Lolita is about the gaze. I mean, obviously it's a male gaze, but it's also like this powerful gaze, you know, when it comes to literal leering and the way Humbert, Nabokov describe Lolita in this over-sexualized objectification, but then also in the power of naming. He almost never calls her Dolores, which is her name. He calls her Lolita. He calls her, you know, Lola, all these sort of like sexualized pet names. But in actuality, and I talk about this in the book, Dolores from the Latin means pain. So it's just this really interesting tension from the get-go. And I think that when I was a teenager, I was very much feeling that tension because I was so sad. I'd had such like serious issues with depression and, you know, insomnia and just not being happy. But then also knowing, well, guys looked at me. Guys thought I was pretty. Guys, you know, wanted to make out with me or sleep with me or whatever. So, and because I was so, I think, deeply unhappy and insecure, which I also think is maybe oversimplifying it, because I do think that it's a larger societal construction about women. We aren't shown examples of how to be powerful, of how to have agency except in our bodies, which is of course then tied to reproduction in our roles as mothers, caretakers, and so forth. But the idea of being the one to look back at the teacher, to sort of gaze back, that felt like power. Not just having me look at him. It felt like I was powerful by, you know, being gazed at and then looking back. And obviously that's not, that was not real power. And it was, you know, part of a larger manipulation and grooming. But at the time, that was the closest I sort of felt like I could feel as power that had to do something that was not strictly about my body, even though it really was. But that's not what I thought at the time.
Yeah. Well, speaking of power, I want to look at desire and power and how they're linked. So, Allison, in your case, you desired the teacher's anointing of you as a young writer, and particularly after dealing with, as you just said, you know, loneliness and depression throughout your teenage years. And Lynn, your main character, Elizabeth, desires some kind of stability and success, and also has struggled with depression. And I think a common theme in both of these books is desire being linked to ambition and the power that holds over you, Allison, and over Elizabeth in Lynn's case. And I also think about the many ways women who are ambitious are criticized in our society. So my first job out of college was working for the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric, and the ways that people would criticize Katie for what she wore on the nightly news or how she styled her hair infuriated me. Speaking of being looked at, I would go through the viewer emails, and constantly that was something I'd see again and again. And so here's a $1 million question, but why is ambition so loaded for women?
My short answer is it's uprooting the patriarchy.
Again, the patriarchy, yes.
Always
Assholes.
My answer to these sort of questions are often at the root. I think it's patriarchy. But a slightly more complicated answer is, well, I think just, you know, a week ago, Kamala Harris was, you know, anointed as the vice presidential candidate, but there was such discussion about whether or not she'd be the right match with Biden because she might be too ambitious. I mean, and that's so frustrating because I feel like we've done so much work about like being bossy and how being I feel like we keep trying to do this work about the power of language and how we name things and how naming things is a sense of control by describing the same actions that a woman would take that a man would take, but by using one in like a negative way, you're controlling that behavior in some ways, you're judging it. And I feel like we keep sort of trying to do this work, but then things like that slide back. And I think as well, in some ways, it comes back to the idea, well, you know, the women's power comes from their bodies because women are over-sexualized. Then if women are choosing to do things like be president, be a CEO, things like that, motherhood and reproduction sort of, you know, will oftentimes take a back seat because it's difficult to do both. I'm lucky, my only children are my cats. And even that feels like a lot sometimes. So, you know, I'm not even sure how you do it, Lynn, but also you've been very frank, which I think is so wonderful in how you've written about that, because the struggle is real. And I think we have this idealized idea of like, well, you can just have it all. And I don't really know if that's true.
Yeah.
I think ambition in women is complicated. And I think
Absolutely.
it is tied to our body.
Yeah. No, I think 100. I mean, the Allison, the thing Michele, as you were asking that question, the thing I was thinking about is the thing Allison did at the end of her answer to the last question when she said, you know, with regard to the gaze, when she said sort of, so he wanted her, so then she felt power in wanting him, which to some extent I feel like is connected to our relationship to female ambition, which is to say women are only allowed to want once they've been shown worthy of wanting, right? And I think that that's true in life, but it's also very true in literature, right? Like how many books do you read about ugly women, right? Like you don't, because to gain entrance to a narrative in which you might be allowed to have wants and fears, the prerequisite is that the narrator be beautiful, right? And the prerequisite of feeling the power that women are supposed to feel when they're 14 or 13 or whatever is explicitly, like Allison said, it's connected to their body, it's connected to sex. So then what about all of the girls that don't feel that power? Then are they never supposed to feel power? Or what other aspects of the female might feel powerful? Even thinking back to the Wolf quote, right? Like what about the brain and what's our relationship to the brain? So I mean, I think, and then, you know, and then you just fall back. I mean, what does patriarchy mean? I have no idea. But I think it comes down to just the sort of systemic and
Could we ask everyone to mute their mic who's watching? We're hearing some noise.
I might be able to mute him. Okay.
It's better, sorry.
It went away. Yeah, I mean, that's right. I think that's it. I think that to me, the easy answer is that prerequisite of being an object before you're allowed to be a subject. And then that really uncomfortable position that women are put in where it's like, oh, no, wait, you were a pretty thing, right? Like we let you come to the party because you were a pretty thing, but now you're here and you're acting like you want to be more than a pretty thing. And that's destabilizing and confusing, right? Like you're allowed to come to the party, but you need to shut up. Right. And I think that's, and again, it's all of these conversations are oversimplifications, but to some extent, I feel like that's the continued cycle we go into. Okay, so in whatever way you manipulated the system, whether that be through the way you look, whether that be through language, whether that be through the manipulation of language such that you feel a little bit not scary, we let you in the room, but you almost certainly had to perform in some way to come into the room. But now you're in the room and you're misbehaving, please leave. Right? And I think that's the experience of a lot of women, right? Is it's sort of like you say that I can be a subject, but only if I'm still an object, and that doesn't work.
Right. Yes.
Well, I think so. I always think about the Nabokov quote, which is like beauty plus pity is the greatest form of art or something like that. And so I think that's like almost exactly what you were just saying, in that, you know, for a woman to be worthy, she has to be beautiful, but then she has to be pitiful. So like not powerful, to be suffering, to be in pain, something like that, because that absence, that space creates a place for a man. If she's powerful, she doesn't need anybody, right? But if she's pitiful, if she's suffering, if she's in pain, if she needs something, then there's a place for a more powerful person, usually a man, to come in and help. So I think this is all so much connected. And I think it's also, you know, how you were saying there aren't a lot of books about ugly women. So often there are books with dead women, beautiful dead women at the end, you know. Someone dies and that's the reason for our hero's choices and his big adventure or whatnot, or he's trying to avenge someone. I mean, it's really unusual, I think, to look at the canon and be able to point to pieces and to books that are, pushing against that. So, just like you were talking about, Lynn, I mean, when I teach, the only male writers that I teach is I teach the first 10 chapters of Lolita within a much larger context. And then the only other thing I teach is what we talk about when we talk about love, because there's the beginner's version, the original. So you can see like the power of editing, which is a lot. So yeah, that's all that
Another connection between being Lolita and Want is that both of you write about inappropriate, abusive male teachers. In Lynn's case, she's referring to a professor instead of a high school teacher. And Allison, at one point in your book, you write, as an adult, I can see how a schoolgirl's everyday unrequited crush transformed into something much darker, much more dangerous. And Lynn, you write of a colleague of Elizabeth's, a male, who argues they're not children when speaking of college students. So how can we shift the power dynamics so that men in a position of authority over young women can't intimidate or manipulate them? And the three of us are all teachers. I'm wondering what we can do to protect our students from predators. That's another loaded question, I know.
Well, I have opinions. When it comes to college, I think it should simply not be allowed for professors to date students. I don't think it should be complicated. I think it should be, if you're a professor, you cannot date a student, because oftentimes there are these exceptions of like, oh, well, I'm not their teacher, they're in a different classroom, they're in a different department or whatnot. But it's like, no, you're in completely different hierarchy structures. Even if you're not their teacher, a professor still has significant power over, especially their undergraduate students. I don't think there's any wiggle room there. And I don't understand why it's always so complicated. Even in my alma mater, there are an awful lot of exceptions to the rule of professors can't date students. Well, actually they can. And there's all sorts of ways that, it's okay. And I have a problem with that. Since I teach undergraduates, I'm very lucky in that a lot of my students, because my course is somewhat self-selective because it's called Powerful Women. It's a creative writing course. So I get a lot of women and non-binary students. And every single semester, I will hear stories about, or these young women will tell me about how they had been abused or taken advantage of by maybe a teacher in high school, another professor, a writing coach, not a writing coach, like a swim coach, things like that. It's so common and ubiquitous and pervasive. And I think there should be some just sort of commonplace things like that on a college campus. And when it comes to high school, I think the biggest problem is that we pass the trash, which is the same thing that happens in, churches and other community groups. So while I never told what had happened to me or the relationship, it's funny, I still don't really know exactly what to call it, because it's not I feel like using the word relationship suggests this sort of like consensualness, but it clearly wasn't. But I don't really know how else to explain the connection. But anyway, I think by the time I wrote this book and it was being published, I've been hearing from people a lot. And so many other students from my school had suspicions, or people knew a lot more than I thought they did. And so did other teachers who were in school at the time. And no one said anything or did anything or raised an alarm or brought it up to anyone. And while I have absolutely no anger or blame towards any other students, it does frustrate me that none of the other teachers who clearly saw me in his room alone with the door closed a lot. There were a couple times when we were spotted by another teacher at like the coffee shop or something, just the two of us. That did happen a few times. And then apparently, allegedly, what happened the following year was that he entered a similar relationship with another girl, and the school found out, but instead of firing him or doing any sort of, public thing that would cause scandal and, bring bad news to the school. They just did not renew his contract. So then he got another teaching job and so forth. And that's what we do. And that's what we've always done with things like this. And I think it's just a huge problem. And I think we should change how we deal with predators. Because as many people do know, it's actually not that much of a secret.
I think your book will help a lot of people, and a lot of, hopefully, principals and teachers will read it too, because it's so important. Lynn, what would you say in your role as a teacher? You're muted. Oop, you're on mute. Oh, I don't know what she's saying. Uh-oh. Let's see if I can unmute her. Oh, here we go.
Wait.
Oh.
You muted yourself again.
Hold on.
There. Can I talk?
Yeah.
Yes. For a while, the host and I were Maris and I were in a fight, and I love Maris. I'm sorry, Maris. There was a situation. So I'm going to sort of use a little bit of my book to talk about Allison's book, which is to say that part of the thing that my book is trying to grapple with is the spaces that policies don't account for, which is to say that like the sort of sexual misconduct in my book is like technically it's allowed, right? Yeah. And I think that Michele, to your point, to me, one of the ways that we account for all of these spaces that policies can't cover, or to Allison's point, policies exist but people ignore them, is, and we're writing teachers, so I'm not saying this is going to solve the world, but I am saying this is where we have a little bit of power, right? Is assigning books like Allison's, is having conversations, is creating classes called Powerful Women, right? Like, is having contextualized conversations about Lolita, right? Like, having these conversations that make a little bit clearer or stretch a little bit more where power lives for women and how power might be enacted for women, and also what trauma might look like for women. Because I think that we don't, and again, I think this is connected to a lot of what Allison's grappling with in her book, is language. Language can be very rigid with regard to our definitions of language, right? And there's that thing that we've all seen 1,000 times where people say, but was it really? Right. And Allison just did it, right? Like, I don't have a word for what we had, right? Like, was it really trauma? Was it really a violation? Well, I don't know, right? And so a thing that I think we can do as teachers is kind of consider the elasticity of those words and help our students to consider the elasticity of those words, and help our students consider, okay, well, I was taught by X that violence is this, but actually all of these other things are violence too. Right. And I was taught that trauma is this, but actually all of these other things are trauma too. Right. And again, I don't think that solves it, but I do think beginning to help people understand the elasticity of these concepts, especially around violation and especially around trauma, through books like Allison's, like through conversations in classrooms, can help people then hopefully more actively or productively enact policies or laws, or make new ones, or just speak up, yeah.
I think also, I totally agree with you. And I know, Michele, we've talked about this as well. But I think we also need to be making spaces where women or, non-binary folks or other folks feel safe and feel like they won't be retaliated against, that they will be believed. And I also think particularly in high school, the trouble is that if someone had confronted me at the time, I would have lied my little pants off and been like, no, it's all me. Nothing ever happened. I would have, but that's because I was being abused and manipulated. And so I think one of the tricky things is, I just read an article a couple weeks ago, I think it was in the New York Times, about how there's this new way of prosecuting domestic violence cases. that some places are trying, because one of the problems with domestic violence cases is that oftentimes the victims, the women, the wives, the girlfriends, decline to then be part of the prosecution because they fear being retaliated against. They're being abused and manipulated. It's a cycle. It's complicated. It's hard to get out of. So what they've begun doing is prosecuting these cases without the victim, without their consent, because they can use other people's testimony, the facts, other evidence, and all sorts of things. So, because that's also like, that's how we convict murderers. The victims are dead, like there's no one there's no one testifying there. And I think that in some ways, thinking about that kind of model when it comes especially to high school or to younger situations like that, because, okay, maybe I would have lied, but there could have been easily a half dozen teachers who were like, yeah, I saw them, the door was closed all the time. I saw them at a coffee shop together alone. Like easily that sort of case could have been made. If someone was interested in making that case. And I think one of the problems is that people don't care and people don't want the trouble. And I think of that even in our university and college systems. I mean, I can think of 5 professors off the top of my hand who are still teaching who have lots of allegations about sleeping with their students. And, it's just fine.
It's all too common.
Yeah.
It's too common. We have a question from the audience, which is Lolita valuable because it reveals how some men get away with grooming?
Lynn, what do you think?
I mean, I feel like you've read it more than I have. I think if I were a writing teacher and if I were sitting in to me, Nabokov is about language, right? And all of this is tied up with grooming, right? But I think if that were the only reason that it were valuable, there would be other entry points, right? But I do think the particular power of language to not just groom, but manipulate. I always tell students when they're writing that they're teaching their readers a new way of thinking, a new logic, a new language, right? And that's always your job as a writer, right? And so the brilliance of Nabokov is that he implicates you in this psyche that once you sort of pull yourself out of it are like, oh, fuck, I don't want to be like, I'm not that guy. I don't want to be that guy, right? But because of his facility with language, he makes you feel like you're that guy, which is interesting and complicated and an accomplishment, right?
Yeah.
But it's a linguistic accomplishment.
Yeah.
I guess one of my qualms with that question, or not a qualm, but one of my answers to that question has to do with sort of what I think books are here to do. And I'm not sure I think every utterance is political, but I don't think that books are here to make arguments. I think they're here to make us ask questions and feel uncomfortable and reconsider arguments we've already had or arguments that we've heard from other people. And in that way, I think Nabokov is successful with regard to making us think and ask questions and feel uncomfortable. I don't know if that fully answers the question. But.
I agree. I mean, I don't think that Lolita is useful to show how you get away with grooming. I think Lolita, although I think that's a very fair question to ask reading Lolita, but I think Lolita in some ways is at its most powerful and its most effective when it shows you how easy it can be to manipulate someone because you as a reader are being manipulated. I mean, in my class, when I teach Lolita, there's always still at least a couple students who will fight, I mean, it doesn't become a fight in my class, but, oh, poor Humbert, he's, if everybody's being so hard on him, he's trying his best, just like come to the defense of Humbert. And so I think it's a great example of how manipulation happens because sort of like you were saying, as the reader, you are being part of that. And I think it's a great tool to sort of show you how it is being done because you can then look on the page and be like, oh, this is how it happened using the power of language. And, it's just, and I think in that way, it's really a wonderful tool, but it's also really problematic as fuck. And it can be both. It's 2020. A book can be beautiful and powerful and effective, and it can also be problematic as fuck. Like, it can be both.
Absolutely. Well, Speaking of books, I wanted to bring up an essay that Lynn wrote, and this is kind of circling back to something we were talking about earlier this evening, but Lynn wrote this essay for the LA Times on women writers called "Is the Literary Trend Toward Passive Women Progress? Maybe We've Been Misreading." And in it, Lynn writes, "Great fiction by women is being written right now, rich and complicated fiction that is upending and rethinking what the form can hold." But then that's not the part that's new. What feels exciting about perhaps the last decade is that this fiction is being reviewed and celebrated, its revolutionary potential occasionally even recognized. In particular, novels about a woman thinking, being talked at, are being actively considered. And you also say, often they are built in fragments, structured around failure, absences, passivity, and lacks. They defy the novelistic demands for a certain type of resolution. They land in spaces of confusion and of questions, refuse to give clear lines between cause and effect. I'd love to hear from both of you on why we're seeing this trend, and if it applies to memoir and personal essays too, in your opinion, or if it should.
Allison, I feel like I have more prep for this question, so
Yeah.
I
was like, what? I know this essay, but
yeah. I mean, I feel like I first want to say that I did not choose that title. I did not love that title of the essay. You know, I think, and one of the arguments of the essay, which I think is connected to the conversation about Nabokov and teaching Nabokov, and also what we can do in classrooms, is to say that, like, fiction and what it is capable of and what its shape might be, it has been pushed and reconsidered and stretched for a very, very long time. It's just that those books weren't read, right? And so I think that's number one. Like, that's my, so that's the first argument within the essay, and I think returns to a lot of what we've talked about with regard to, as teachers, what can we do to help students understand sort of how these words can be stretched, and then how formally books can be stretched. Well, we can show them, right? And we don't need to go to the last 10 years. We can go to the last 100 years. And there were lots of writers doing this work. They just weren't being paid attention to because, probably because they were ambitious women, right? They were objects acting up. They were acting up objects. And so then to your other question, I think, which was about sort of why we're seeing these forms, I do, and I guess this is my favorite word tonight, I do think it's connected again to this idea of, so we have this form of the novel that was built by men, and men have more agency than women, right? So if you have a form that was built by people who have a different relationship to agency than the people who are now trying to use it, it's going to break. Right? Because when a man makes a choice, and again, like, this is a very reductive, but let's just play this game. When a certain type of narrator makes a choice, they act on that choice, and a result of that action, there's an interaction and there's a reaction, and oh, that's fiction, right? That's what writing professors tell you that you're supposed to make. Except when a woman, again, very stretchy, made-up term that is also a lot of people, when another person who is not a wealthy white man makes a choice, the idea that they get to act on that choice is often patently absurd, right? So the idea that we have constructed the concept of the novel around action, interaction, and reaction, around arcs, around wants that someone might pursue, right? How many individuals, I mean, right, like, how many individuals right now do you know who have the resources, the privilege, and the status in the world to be able to pursue their wants? There aren't that many. I mean, I won't answer for you, right? But, like, if you start to think about that, how then do you construct a narrative within the form that we've been given? If you want to talk about those people, it's quite hard, right? So then, excitingly, I think the form is sort of being stretched. My stupid gestures, I finally see them, and I'm so nervous. But yeah, I think that's my answer. Allison, you can, yeah.
I think my answer to that is, so when I was writing the book, I really consciously, this is sort of my sidestepping answer. So when I was writing the book, I really consciously wanted it to be very readable. I wanted to sort of structure it like a novel in some ways versus sort of being more of a traditional memoir in some ways. And something that I've heard a lot from readers is that people think it's a novel a lot of times. They get confused because it does sort of feel like a novel, I think, in the beginning. And I think part of that is because even though there's a first person, obviously it's a memoir, it's still, I really, really tried to stay true to 17 and 18-year-old Allison's point of view. I tried really hard to capture that. And that was in a lot of ways an act of fictionalization, because I am 36. I am no longer 17 and 18. You know, so that was an act of creation. And of course, all eyes on the page, all, you know, it's all an act of creation. But to create my 17 and 18-year-old self, you know, I leaned on a lot of primary sources like my journals, letters from him, photographs, ephemera, hotel receipts, like all sorts of like physical objects. And I was lucky in that I had a lot of stuff to go back to. But I really want to try to capture that almost passivity I felt at the time, because I felt trapped. I felt trapped in my body. I felt trapped in my place in the world. I felt trapped in who I had been and who I was trying to become. And then I felt trapped in the relationship, relationship. And so part of what I tried to do in the book was show that journey from sort of feeling trapped and in some way passive and trying to have agency in the way that I knew how, which is of course through sexuality, and, you know, through flirting or things like that, because that was all I knew and all that I felt like I had any sort of authority on my body, and how I've tried to come to a different place now and to, you know, have agency and model agency to my students, for instance. So I hope
that's
that
a lovely
question.
Yeah, it's a great note to end on. I see Maris has joined us again. I think we've run out of time, right?
I hate that it's over. We need this forever, but and thank you for a wonderful evening. Thank you, Allison, Lynn, Michele. Thank you to the audience for being wonderful. Reminder to buy their books, please. You've got the links, and thank you for modeling, Michele.
Thank you, Michele.
And
Congratulations,
Allison. Let's like
Yeah.
give her a virtual round of
Congratulations, Allison.
Congrats, Allison.
We all owe you a drink.
Yes.
Okay.
That's fine. I'm okay with that. Yeah.
2022, we're going to get a drink.
Drinking next year.
Yeah.
Looking forward to that. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.